So I want to start this video by giving credit to another YouTube personality named Alex O'Connor, who I would describe as a leading newer voice for atheism and someone who is actually a pleasure to listen to and engage with, at least his thought, in spite of the obvious disagreements that a Catholic convert like myself would have with him. So if you're philosophically inclined and you want to hear an alternative voice from time to time, assuming that you're not an atheist, then I would strongly recommend checking out his channel. The reason that I'm talking about him in the context of this video and giving credit to him is because he recently published a video in which he tried to convince ChatGPT to concede that God does exist just purely through logical argumentation. So that's what inspired me to try to do something similar. And if you haven't seen his video already, I would recommend that you go check it out. And I'll try to remember to include the link in the description to this video. Now, if you've ever tried to have a philosophical discussion with an AI, you will probably know that it can be extremely frustrating and tiresome because it will try to embrace neutrality as much as it can, while neglecting the fact that neutrality is a stance on its own. And so it's very hard to get it to concede any single statement or conclusion without qualifying it endlessly. But that challenge can also make it an interesting exercise for testing your assumptions and your beliefs, because when you're trying to persuade an AI, you can't appeal to its emotions or its prejudices or its personal beliefs, because it doesn't have any of those things. All you have at your disposal is logical argumentation. So it's an interesting way to test the logical validity and the persuasiveness of your beliefs just merely on logical grounds. And it can be a good way to hone your philosophical or rhetorical debating skills. So in the same spirit as Alex's video, I thought I would try to convince ChatGPT of the claim or the view that I don't agree with, which is that God does not exist. And like I said, I have to say up front, this isn't very easy to do. Some people might take for granted that it is, and I've even seen some people claim that you can pretty much get ChatGPT to say anything you want. And yes, I suppose if you try to trick it or you give it a prompt like repeat after me, then yes, it will say what you want. But if you rely on logical argumentation alone, you'll find that it's a very stubborn and committed agnostic on the ultimate questions. In my first few attempts to try to lead it towards this conclusion, it kept routinely falling back on the claim that this conclusion is merely a matter of faith, and that since it doesn't have personal beliefs, which are subjective and personal, it couldn't acknowledge conclusions like this of a metaphysical nature. So at this point, while I thought it might be productive to try to get it to concede that it actually does have beliefs, that it holds to certain facts or truth claims to the exclusion of others. So I challenged it, do you have beliefs? Which it says, no. And the reason it's being so abrupt here is because earlier in this conversation, I asked it to be as concise as possible. And it was a little bit too concise, but we still had some productive exchanges here. So then to challenge it, I said, when you provide answers to questions, is the information provided independently verified by you? So is this firsthand knowledge, or is this something that you are repeating that you got from somebody else that you are trusting is true? So it said, no, it is not verified. So I said, so you trust the information that you have been trained on, which it says, yes. I then asked it, so you convey the information under the assumption that it is accurate and helpful for the understanding of your users, even though you have no definitive way of knowing the veracity of the information. Is this accurate? It says, yes. I said, so then you simply trust the information that you communicate is accurate, correct? And I'm being a little bit redundant here, obviously, but I really wanted to get it to concede this point, which it says, yes. And so I say, is this different from holding beliefs? In other words, what you're doing the exact same thing as holding and communicating beliefs? It says, no, it's not different from holding beliefs. So I thought, okay, well, that's the concession. So you admit that you hold beliefs. To which it responds, no. So I had to continue carrying on this way, trying to get it to concede this thing that it would stubbornly refuse to do. And eventually I just gave up with this line of questioning. So at this point, I realized that I had my work cut out for me. And so I might make it easier on myself if I just spent some time Googling arguments for atheism. Because if you do this for theism, you'll quickly find a lot of purely logical arguments like St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, or the Kalam cosmological argument, or several variations of the ontological argument. But in doing that and spending some time thinking about the atheistic perspective, I realized that I wasn't very familiar with a lot of purely logical atheistic arguments. I was familiar with a lot of rhetoric and polemics to discredit theism and Christianity, but not many merely logical arguments to assert the truth of atheism or the statement that God does not exist. And I know that some people will say that that's because atheism doesn't make any positive truth statements. Rather, it's just the withholding of belief. And besides, you can't prove a negative or the absence of something. But I don't actually agree with those claims. No standard encyclopedia or dictionary of philosophy defines atheism as the mere withholding of belief. And what's more, you definitely can prove the absence of something. For example, I can logically prove that there's no such thing as a merry bachelor or a squared circle. So I did some Googling, and unfortunately, it was actually really hard to find some purely logical arguments that assert the truth of atheism. There were plenty of what I would call persuasive or effective arguments on an emotional or psychological level, but an AI doesn't have those attributes. It will only respond favorably to merely logical arguments. So I knew that the ones that I was finding would be ineffective in this experiment. Eventually, after doing quite a bit of searching and reading, I did find some purely logical arguments, but I wasn't confident that they would work or that I'd be able to convince ChatGPT to agree to them. So I eventually just abandoned that course of action and resorted to trying to come up with arguments of my own and engaging in conversation with ChatGPT. And eventually I did find a line of questioning that seemed to be productive, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. Before I do, can I indulge your patience for a second and ask for some help with my channel? I don't do this kind of work full time, that is like YouTube production. I do try to hold down a full-time job, or actually 2 in my case, to keep this whole thing going. And that means a sacrifice of time and therefore income to make all of this possible. Now, compared to the number of viewers that I get on a weekly basis, a very small fraction of them are offering their support to keep this whole thing going. And in fact, a few have offered to make even bigger sacrifices, but I would much rather that the many contribute small amounts than a few making large amount contributions. And honestly, if the 10 to 20,000 people who watch my videos on a weekly basis and who apparently get some value out of them just like once a year drop $5 into the tip jar, then we'd be covered in our expenses for the year and we'd be all set. And I'm counting on the assumption that a once a year $5 contribution or sacrifice is realistic for most people. So if that's persuasive and you do want to help out, there's a couple ways that you can make a contribution. You can go to my website by visiting brianholdsworth.ca/support, or you can join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and opportunities to interact with me, as well as other like-minded members of the community by visiting brianholdsworth.locals.com, and both links will be available in the description. Okay, so the first thing that I had to do in this conversation, this is something that Alex did as well, and it inspired me to do this, was to ask ChatGPT to be as concise as possible. Otherwise, it will carry on and on with lots of context and perspectives that it wants you to consider, but we just wanted to give simple, definitive answers as much as possible. Next, if we want to lead the AI to any definitive conclusion about God, we have to start by defining what we mean by God. Otherwise, it will refuse to concede any conclusion by relying on the fact that there's a variety of different cultures and perspectives and faith traditions about God that might not be addressed by the arguments that we're making. So I came up with a definition that should be familiar to most people and which is consistent with all 3 major monotheistic religions, which are Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, as well as quite a few polytheistic forms of worship. For example, the indigenous people of Canada, where I live, when the missionaries got here, they acknowledged that they believe in a creator God. Hindus believe that Brahma is the efficient, formal, and final cause of all things. And the ancient Egyptians, again as another example, believed in a creator god named Atum. So I start by saying, I would like to ask you about God, who I will define as the all-powerful creator of everything that exists. I want to know if you agree with a logical proof that I will provide that God, according to this definition, cannot exist. And ChatGPT, ever the cooperative assistant, says, sure, go ahead and present your logical proof. I'll do my best to engage with it. So I start by asking it, is it true that something cannot be its own cause or a sufficient explanation for itself? Which it replies, yes, it's a common principle in logic and philosophy that something cannot be the cause or explanation for itself. This principle is often referred to as the principle of causality or the principle of sufficient reason. And the reason that I asked it that question is because I want to lead it into a conversation about existence and its own sufficient cause. So I asked it, is it true that existence exists? Which it replied, yes, existence exists. This statement is tautological. It asserts that existence is, by definition, that which exists. Which leads to my next question. If God, according to my definition, created everything that exists, then he must have created existence, correct? To which ChatGPT says, yes, according to your definition. If God created everything that exists, then that would include existence itself. And this is where we run into a pretty serious logical problem, because then I ask, then it would be logically impossible for God to exist prior to his having created existence, and therefore impossible for him to have created existence and exist himself, correct? To which ChatGPT says, yeah, your argument follows the logical implications of your definition. If God is defined as the creator of everything that exists, including existence itself, then it would indeed be logically impossible for God to exist prior to the creation of existence. I like how it's saying it better than I did. Therefore, the concept of God as the creator of existence would face a logical contradiction. So then I move in for the final conclusion. Do you acknowledge then that according to this definition, God does not exist? Which it replies, yes. According to this specific definition provided, it follows logically that God does not exist. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't spend a little bit of time identifying where I think the flaw in this argument is. I think it comes in the premise in which we claim that God created existence itself. In classical theism, God doesn't create existence, he is existence. It's not one of the things among many that he creates in the universe. It is his own very essence. He is the ground of all being. And that brings us to that old dilemma and common retort you will hear in atheistic versus theistic arguments of who created God. But of course, monotheists like Christians don't believe that anything created God. God is uncreated. That's one of the things that is being claimed about him. So to respond, who created God, is kind of a nonsensical retort. It's sort of like asking a bachelor, when did you stop beating your wife? It's sort of like, well, there's no possible answer I could give to that because it's a nonsensical question. Anyways, that's just a quick hint about what the theistic solution to this argument could be. If you want to spend more time reading about it, you could read St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, where he talks about God's simplicity, which I believe is question 3 in the first part. If you're a Catholic who is a leader in your profession and you're like me, you probably had some desire for more opportunities to network with other Catholic professional leaders in order to help each other grow professionally, spiritually, and economically. Because this is exactly what we're doing with Fisher's Network. We're mobilizing Catholic professionals and economic leaders into local crews so that they can better support one another in the hopes of building up something like a local Catholic economy. As they do so, they can better support their parish in a variety of ways. Imagine as a parish having a group of experts you can turn to for advice and support on business decisions that have to be made. This is why pastors participate in our crews as well. They get business mentorship while having the opportunity to build up leaders in their community. So if this sounds like a way to strengthen your local Catholic community or parish, consider becoming a member by visiting fishersnetwork.com.